there was not a lot being done on Black literary figures. And that's why I kind of took the responsibility to do that.
Hey y'all, I'm Dawnie Walton.
And this is Deesha Philyaw.
And welcome to the Ursa podcast, where we geek out on all things short fiction. On this podcast, we'll interview authors, discuss collections and stories we love, and shine a light on new writers and those who never got their due. And at Ursa, we're not just talk, we're publishers too. Over at ursastory.com, we've created a new home for short fiction from some of today's most thrilling writers, as well as emerging voices, with stories you can read on your phone and audio stories that you can listen to right here in your favorite podcast app. We're doing all of this with support from you. Become an Ursa member today by subscribing in Apple Podcasts or by going to ursastory.com/join.
If you've checked out Ursa before, you may have heard our episode about a hidden figure of the literary world, Diane Oliver, a young Black woman who published several pieces of fiction by the time of her death at age 22. Today, we're thrilled to go even deeper about her talent with our guest, the writer and cultural critic who first brought her to our attention, Michael A. Gonzales.
Welcome, Michael.
Good afternoon. It's great to be here. Thank you.
And to tell the people a little bit about you, so you're a Harlem native and a cultural critic, short story scribe, and essayist who's written for Vibe, The Source, The Paris Review, The Village Voice, Wax Poetics, The Wire UK, Long Reads, and Pitchfork. Your short fiction has appeared in Under the Thumb, Stories of Police Oppression, edited by S.A. Cosby, wonderful writer, Taint, 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 and also Black Pulp, edited by Gary Phillips.
Welcome, welcome. Thanks for chatting with us today.
I'm so happy that we're talking about Diane Oliver. I mean, as you know, she's somebody I just discovered a few months ago. And, I've been researching her and writing about her, and it's been a thrill.
Yeah. And as I mentioned in the intro, you're the reason we even know who she is, because you reached out to me and said, hey, I'm doing this article on Diane Oliver. I want to know, get some thoughts from you about her work. And I was really embarrassed to say I had not heard of her. And so I just am really, we all are, really thankful that you are reintroducing her to the reading public.
Well, I have to tell you, you're not the only one. I didn't even know about her until November. One of my friends was moving, and in the process, he sent me this anthology called Right On. That was a book from 1971 of short Black fiction. And for some reason, I always say that the gods directed me to this story. I just opened up the book and I honed in on her story, and I read Neighbors. And after reading Neighbors, I was like, oh my goodness, I needed to know more about this woman. I couldn't understand, why so many literate and literary people I knew had never heard of Diane Oliver. So I was intrigued, not just by her work, but by her legacy. And so I just started digging. Thank God there's issues of Black World, which was actually called Negro Digest first, and then it became Black World. That's where I found a few of her short stories. And I also found out some autobiographical facts about her that helped me along in putting together this essay on her that's actually on the Bitter Southerner now.
Amazing. Yeah. Her name was also a name that was completely new to me. And we discussed those stories from Negro Digest in depth, and Health Service and Traffic Jam. We both just really, really love those stories. And we're sort of astonished by the talent that she had in The Promise. Mm-hmm. But, we found when we were kind of doing some rudimentary research about her writing, there was really scant information available about her. We found, I think, 4 stories of her online, and we learned a little bit of biographical information about her North Carolina roots. And we also knew she was just mere days away, really, from earning her MFA at Iowa Writers Workshop when she was killed in a motorcycle accident. So I just wonder if you can take us through a little bit of your research process in sort of really digging into it and what new details you were able to discover.
Well, whenever I get attached to a subject, I become obsessed. And I don't really go to the library as much as I used to, but I was able to find a lot of things online. I mean, when I start researching, I go to Google, but I also look at every search engine that I could possibly think of. I look at Yahoo, I look at Bing, I go to Google Images and see if I could find anything. I go to Google Books, which is where I found a lot of stuff. There was things that had been done for some academic journals on her background. And I found some information about her old writing teacher, who was one of her mentors, a guy named Pete Taylor, who I had never heard of either, but apparently he was a major short story writer in the 40s and 50s, and the New York Times had called him one of the best short story writers. I mean, there's just so much information. You just have to know where to look for it. And so I just had a lot of patience and just started digging.
Yeah, just one of the first things you mentioned is the anthology you found, Right On, and I was like, wait, this is not the teen like I don't know.
That's like, exactly what
Right
I thought
on.
too. I was so confused.
It came out actually around the same time, and I don't know who. Because I'm a Right On baby. Okay, I grew up on Right On magazine, and they even spelled it. I mean, they even had the exclamation
exclamation
I was
mark.
like, who does this? But
I was like, let me find out she was right for Right On magazine.
Oh my God, no. But Right On, in the 70s, there were a lot of Black anthologies. In the 60s and the 70s, a lot of Black anthologies that had Black short stories, Black plays, Black poetry. I mean, I don't really see them. I mean, like nowadays I'll see singular collections, but I won't see like a wide collection. You know what I mean? That has a lot of different writers that's part of a collective or part of a generation or whatever. And so Right On was, I've never even seen this book in used bookstores. And believe me, I used to live in used bookstores.
Well, that sort of segues into the next question that I have for you. So I very much appreciate not only a man who reads, but a man who reads stories by and about women. And you're a writer, and as writers, we are often finding inspiration in each other. So just wanted to ask you, what in these stories by her spoke most deeply to you, Michael, as a writer or as a reader?
I liked reading about the South, during Jim Crow or coming out of Jim Crow, but she wrote about it with such sensitivity, and she just had a style about her that just kind of pulled you into the stories. I hope this doesn't come across as an insult or anything, but it wasn't like over intellectualized or, anything that was above your head. To me, it was just like she wrote this, and there was a style to it, but it was also a simplistic kind of way of bringing you into these topics. I loved it because it kind of reminded me of reading Shirley Jackson, who could make the everyday kind of horrifying. And we all know racism, whether it was during Jim Crow or yesterday, is scary. Especially when you're put in certain situations. When you read the story Neighbors and you realize, this family is having to deal with whether or not to send their 6-year-old son to integrate a school the following day, and the repercussions that can come from that, whether it's, somebody spits on him or somebody shoots him. I mean, this is what they were having to deal with. And you're like, she opens the story with that tension of the protagonist, who's the boy's older sister. And you just kind of follow it through. And I've read a lot of stories from that era, and she just pulled me into it. I mean, she's writing about the South from the perspective of somebody who's finished school and gone to college, but she also knows these people. I mean, these were the people that were a part of her community as well. I mean, I think a lot of times people don't realize that Jim Crow and segregation is like, you could be living down the block from a Black millionaire, but he couldn't go anywhere because of, these rules or whatever. So she saw a lot that was going on. I mean, her parents were educators, so she saw a lot in terms of what was going on with the integration at that period.
And in terms of her, would love if you could shed any more light on her background, her family life. She was pretty middle class, right?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at pictures of her, she has this almost debutante kind of look. She looks very middle class, like the kind of young Black women that were featured on the society pages of Jet and Ebony. And it was kind of funny because a year before, was writing about people who came out of like, the Jack and Jills, or people who came out of more educated Black society. And she was one of those kind of people. But at the same time, I think a lot of times, or we perceive people of that, what do we call it, that station or whatever, to look down on people who have less than them. And maybe some of them do, but she wasn't that kind of person. You get a understanding from her. I mean, there's like, she may not have lived through all the things that she wrote about, but she wasn't telling any lies. I mean, she knew what she was talking about.
When you said, that class of folks, I immediately thought about Lawrence Otis Graham's Our Kind of People.
Yes.
And so Diane Oliver has that background on paper, no pun intended, but then her stories, as you said, not only do they focus on, working class folks, but she does it in a way that's not othering and it's not diminishing. It's very respectful.
It's not judgmental at all. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, with the exception of, what was the story? The Closet on the Top of the Stairs, where she writes. I found that in the anthology, so I'm not sure if you read that, but that was about the young Black woman who goes to college, and she's the only Black person there, and what she's dealing with her classmates and roommates and that kind of stuff, to the point where it literally drives her crazy.
Wow.
I mean, it's deep. I mean, I'm laughing, but it's more like, this is what racism can do. I mean, people don't understand the anxiety or the stress that comes with people who look at you like you're a creature, or who looks at you like you're so different or whatever. And the girls in the college, they didn't say anything to her face, but they whispered a lot and they looked a lot. And, to the point where, I mean, she literally went into the closet and didn't want to come out.
I'm glad you brought that story up, because that was actually one of the ones that we could not find, The Closet on the Top Floor. And the other was Mint Juleps Not Served Here. Can you tell us a little bit about that story? Because I'm very curious.
Mint Juleps was, oh my God, it was like this wild kind of gothic story about these Black people who basically just go live in the woods. And they didn't want to be, they didn't want to have to live under white authority. And it's a very brutal kind of story. I don't want to give away too much of it, but literally that one was like more of the Southern Gothic kind of thing, like the kind of stories that like Flannery O'Connor or Faulkner or, even early Truman Capote might have, I've always loved those kind of stories of people who really don't want to be bothered with civilized world, people who kind of cut themselves off from, whether it's the government or whatever, they just want to live their lives and be left alone. And basically, Mint Juleps is about a couple with their mute son who wants to be left alone, and they're not left alone.
And you also mentioned, you sort of saw an influence, like a horror kind of influence in some of these stories, and, it reminded you in some ways of the work of Jordan Peele. And I'm just sort of wondering what other kinds of influences or what artists do you kind of see Diane Oliver in their work?
To tell you the truth, I'm a big fan of Shirley Jackson. Like, I love The Lottery. I love her short stories. Yeah. And I don't know if Diane Oliver had ever read or even knew who Shirley Jackson was. I mean, she was a bright young woman. She was living in New York in the early 60s when Shirley Jackson was publishing in the New Yorker. So I don't know if that was ever an influence, but to me, it was almost like she kind of brought to mind Shirley Jackson and like Flannery O'Connor. And I like horror stories that aren't necessarily about like people getting killed off or a lot of blood or whatever. I like
Psychological horror.
Psychological horror, exactly. Or
Mhm.
even like the kind
Mhm.
of horror like the Asian directors were doing at one time. Like you always feel like there's some creepiness going on. You don't know exactly what it is, but it just feels scary. And to me, like I wasn't really trying to say that she was a horror writer, but I was just equating racism with horror.
Sure.
And like to me, like a prime example of that is like looking at one of my favorite movies and one of the scariest movies is the original Night of the Living Dead, right? And you're like, after this guy has battled with zombies all night long, he gets killed by a white gang, and it's like, for real? Like this brother, this black guy fought zombies all night, but the thing that killed him was the white mob.
Right.
And that's kind of, when I was reading Diane's stories, like even reading Neighbors, I mean, it was like, what's going to happen?
Yeah, I was going to say the tension of them in that house, sort of waiting
exactly
for something to happen, waiting through the night, trying to make this decision. There's lots of tension in that.
I mean, okay, I guess this is a spoiler, but I didn't like the way they decided at the end not to send the boy to school. I was shocked because like every civil rights story you read or you see on a PBS special is about how, the family said, okay, forget all of that. We're going to send this kid to school anyway. And this family was like, you know what? We don't need this.
See, I read it as an ambiguous ending. I thought it was a little gray.
I think I originally read it as they didn't send him, but it was a little uncertain.
But whether they sent him or not, it was still, like you said, the tension that was going on. I mean, even the tension of, when she's on the bus, she's already thinking about this. I mean, this is like obsessed her whole life. She's walking through the neighborhood and everybody from the neighborhood bum to the neighborhood gossip is talking about this little boy going to integrate to school. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on them. And then there's a lot of like, what's going to happen? Are they going to kill this kid? Are they going to blow up the house? Or, you don't know.
Yeah. The closet on the top floor, the way you describe it. So a character who is being watched and examined by a sort of white gaze kind of actually had me thinking a little bit about another part of your essay. So you also spoke with one of Diane Oliver's, I think, was she an acquaintance from the Iowa Writers Workshop? Suzanne McConnell? Yes. So I went to Iowa Writers Workshop. I will say it's a very different place. I actually found some wonderful community. There were several Black women in my class, and we were able to sort of, build a family and find our readers among each other. And I know that that was not the case for her in the 1960s.
Yeah, I mean, I think when she went, it might have been like, I mean, it was relatively new. I don't even know if it had the same kind of cachet that it has today. I mean, the fact that she and John Edgar Wideman were there at the same time, I kind of guess indicates what kind of program it was. Like these were like some serious writers coming out of there. But when she went, I don't know if she realized how much ground she was breaking.
And I kind of wonder if she felt supported or actually that she was known. I mean, I think, so you quote Suzanne McConnell as saying that Diane seemed cautious and careful, but I suppose considering what she was surrounded by, she had to be that way. But I found it really telling that when Suzanne McConnell sort of wrote about Diane Oliver's death around the time, she actually got a lot wrong. Like she got the last name wrong, her place of origin wrong. And I'm not really sure what question I'm trying to ask, but just how did that strike you in terms of learning about Diane's life and her experience that she might have found herself in at such a tender age?
I think we have to realize that a lot of this happened years ago. I mean, this was in 1966 when, they were there. And I think when Suzanne wrote about it later on, it was like 30 years later.
Oh, I see. Okay.
She wrote about it she actually went back and made some corrections to the essay, but I don't think any of it was like really intentional. I mean, I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Well, I'll share how I reacted to that, because we're kind of looking to her, and this was us reading, your essay, Michael, as someone who was there. And I think it speaks volumes about something that happens to so many of us as Black folks, specifically Black writers in white spaces. There's our experience and our perception of it, and then there's white people's perception of our experiences, right?
Exactly.
And so, so Suzanne is saying, she had to be, felt like she had to be careful and cautious. She was very thoughtful and not wild at all. And I said, wait, hold up. Did she expect Diane to be wild? Why? And so
Well, you know what? I have to confess that came out because we were discussing another writer that I had written about. This woman named, and the other writer I had written about had this whole wild background of booze and drugs and everything. And so Suzanne was telling me that Diane was the opposite of that.
Gotcha. Okay. But I think the larger issue, because in general, I think I'm always skeptical, right? And, Suzanne says that she got along well with the fellow students. And it just made me kind of wish that we could hear more from Diane herself. And then we think about the story of the closet at the top of the stairs, how much of that reflected how Diane actually felt in white academic spaces,
You're right.
So I had this, I was just thinking about, what I'm calling her Diane's triple consciousness as a Black woman, building on Du Bois's concept of how Black folks have the double consciousness, but as a Black woman, this triple consciousness. And so, those of us who are writing today, like the three of us, we can shout from the rooftops. We've got social media. The future generations won't have to wonder so much about, the three of us. But I'm thinking now more broadly, and would love your thoughts on this, Michael, about Black literary legacies and how they're shaped. Who gets to tell the storyteller stories?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question because, I mean, that was one of the reasons I started writing these literary essays in the first place. I first started writing it for Catapult. I was writing a column over there called The Blacklist. Mm-hmm. And basically, I came up with The Blacklist because I wanted to write about writers that basically had kind of were out of print. A lot of people hadn't heard of them. So the first one that I did was Negrophobia by Darius James. And then I later on wrote about Henry Dumas, Kirsten Hunter, who wrote The Landlord, and Julian Mayfield. I'm fascinated with Black writers' lives anyway, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But then when you read about these, writers who, it was a different time, a different era. And, just so many writers who, were big names at one time, they kind of fade away sometimes, and I don't know why that is. I think my whole thing was I saw like there was like a new reissue of some Beat Generation novel. And I'm like, how many damn Beat Generation novels do we need? Like how many reissues of William Burroughs and Jack Kerouac can one person stand, And meanwhile, Julian Mayfield is out of print. Charlotte Carter is out of print. Henry Dumas is out of print. These books are going for hundreds of dollars on Amazon, and nobody, Black, white, or whatever, hardly knows who these people are. Henry Dumas is probably the most famous because he was a discovery of Toni Morrison's, after his death. And, she published a few of his stories. But, there was not a lot being done on, Black literary figures. And that's why I kind of took the responsibility to do that. I wrote an essay on Ronald L. Fair, who wrote the novel that Cornbread Earl and Me is based on. I wrote an essay about him for a book. And that kind of started me on this whole thing. He was a Chicago writer, not a contemporary of Richard Wright's, but, like a generation afterwards. And he wrote 3 novels and basically just kind of faded away. And so when I wrote about Cornbread Earl and Me was because, it was based on this blaxploitation movie that I grew up with. Larry Fishburne's first movie. And that was one of my first essays on Black literary writers. And then I'm, for Catapult. And I'm telling you, it's fulfilling to me because I want people to know about these writers. I always feel like there's a shame, that these writers aren't better known.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing against, I love all the big names. I love Toni Morrison. I love James Baldwin. But, a lot of times people act like those are the only two. And
Right.
Right.
so much more. There's so much more now. There's so much more 30 years ago.
One thing that Deesha and I discussed when we went very deep with the stories, we sort of noticed the 4 stories that we read were about women and sometimes the choices that women make. So we read Neighbors, Key to the City, Health Service, and Traffic Jam. And they all kind of end on a note of resignation, looking at a choice that the women characters are kind of either forced to make, circumstance has forced them to make it. And so we kind of thought, wow, if Diane Oliver had lived longer, how might that have changed? Might she have written work where the characters are a little bit more, a little bit more rebellious or a little bit more kind of not resigned in that same way? And so I was just curious how you think that Diane Oliver might have evolved as a writer, how her sensibilities might have changed had she lived longer.
I don't know. I mean, I would love to have read a novel from her. I would have loved to see in what direction she would have gone in. I mean, Diane Oliver's, she had been writing for a few years before her death in 1966, but I think like some of those last stories, she was becoming a better writer, a more haunting writer. A lot of times the stories just felt richer. And during that era, I grew up in the 70s. So I remember my mom having books from like Ntozake Shange and Alice Walker and Toni Morrison and, writers like that. But like we didn't have a lot of the 60s stuff except for in the anthologies. So I don't know where Diane Oliver would have gone, because she kind of was in the middle of, like between generations. It would be curious to find out where she would have gone. I mean, I don't know if there was any archives. I'm sure there must have been notes.
Well, I do know she does have, I think, a thesis on file at the University of Iowa that I've been trying to figure out how to get my hands on. Yes.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Really?
So I kind of started the process and I'm trying to figure out how to do it. And I'm not
wonderful.
even sure, it might be versions of work that was already published posthumously, because I do know that Negro Digest did a couple of posthumous stories by her. But it's fascinating to know that there could be work of hers there that unfortunately never saw the light of day.
One of the things that we were touching on was just talking about being a Black person in a writers group. And, I'm sure all of us have dealt with that at one time. I mean, when I started writing, I was writing more fantasy stories as opposed to more realistic stories. So I didn't have a lot of kickback, but I've heard so many horror stories from brilliant writers, Black writers, Puerto Rican writers, Dominican writers, of the things that they had to endure when they were part of all-white writer circles or all-white writers groups or whatever, whether it was a lack of understanding or people just zoned out on their stories because they didn't feel they were important or something. And, I don't get any of that from Diane's writings, but I'm sure she must have. I mean, I wonder how she overcame being the only one, not just the only, the only Black woman in this group. I mean, we were dealing with a time where sexism and, misogyny on campus was rampant. I mean, people think academics is a goody-goody, but, we know differently. And, being in in the mid 60s when all of this stuff was going. I mean, even her white writing professor from undergrad, Peter Taylor, he encouraged her writing, but he didn't want her to get too mixed up in writing about civil rights or writing about race, or it's the same kind of thing where they want you to do well, but then they want you to do what they want you to do.
Their way. Well, and I read that in your essay where you mentioned that, that was sort of his guidance for her. And I love that clearly she ignored him. And she absolutely, wrote about, not only did she write about the civil rights movement, but she wrote about, she wasn't on like that respectability tip. She was writing about working class people. She was writing about, women in marriages that weren't great, and that she was writing about women, and because so much of the narrative around the civil rights movement that we've been given in fiction and nonfiction does focus on men. And the women, are always in the, relegated to the background, but she centers the women in her fiction. So she not only ignored, her professor's guidance, but she took it even further around class and gender. And so, I'm getting like real badass vibes from her.
That is true. Yes. And I do, as someone who has been through sort of the institutional workshop experience, it's just as important to know what to ignore as it is what advice to listen to. And your ear becomes very attuned to that kind of thing. So the fact that she was able to do that, thank God for it.
Yeah, I mean, I found that, I had a good friend of mine, I'm not going to say his name, but he wrote an excellent novel. And he told me when he was in the writer's workshop that people were just saying negative stuff to him, or like, spouting off or saying stuff is too racial. I don't know why it's always too racial when it's about us.
Well, that's code for this is making me uncomfortable.
Right.
But but it's like, you don't even have to write about stuff to make them uncomfortable to be uncomfortable. You know what I mean? Like, you can write about like driving around in your hoopty through the hoods, smoking a blunt, listening to Earth and Fire, and they're like, I don't understand. Like, why don't you understand? Like, what the hell?
Or it's okay if you don't understand. It's that they're not centered when they're, there's something to be said for reading work where you and people like yourself aren't centered. Like, there's the benefits of that and the pleasure of that. And I think it's hard for people who are used to being centered in literature to then not be.
Well, I think as Black writers, I know even with me growing up, I was blessed that I had somebody at home who actually read Black work. Because a lot of writers, they don't read Black fiction or other Black writers until they're in college or something. I was reading Ntozake Shange when I was a kid. I was like, reading For Color Girls and books of poetry and, the stuff that my mother had on her shelf, because she never, censored me from reading anything. But at the same time, it's like, there's so many writers that I know who, didn't discover those voices until years later. So, a lot of times they don't know how to write about themselves. I always tell people that one of my biggest influences growing up was Richard Pryor, because the way he wrote about the hood. A lot of writers, they don't have those kind of influences, and, they may even try to write white, quote unquote, and that doesn't work too much either.
I can think of a writer who told me something similar, that, they thought, as a Black writer, that to write seriously, to be taken seriously, to be considered a literary writer, that they had to center white folks. And then, but, thankfully, this is a writer who eventually was like, nah, I'm not doing that. But I think some people do get stuck there. Or even just think about Toni Morrison, that New York Times critic that wrote about, I believe it was The Bluest Eye, and was so condescending and referred to it as provincial, and hoped that Morrison would eventually grow up and stop writing about Black people and Black life.
Unbelievable.
It's wild.
It's crazy. Like, a lot of those guys, especially one of my heroes is Chester Himes. And Chester Himes was cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. And, some of his early literary novels before he started writing the Harlem gangster novels. But, people were, basically dismissive of it. And part of him going to Europe, I mean, I don't even know if he was ever really happy in Europe. He was just less mad. But, I mean, part of that was like, him and James Baldwin both, they were like, if we stay in America too much longer, we're going to wind up hurting somebody or killing somebody. And, I'm sure a lot of that probably came from dealing with editors who didn't understand where they were coming from. Even when Richard Wright published his landmark books, Native Son and Black Boy, there's chunks of it that's taken out by the Book Club of America, which was a big sponsor, because they didn't want to make people uncomfortable. I mean, it's like, wow, when I read that was an actual thing, I mean, I was really hurt for Richard Wright,
Yeah, I am just thankful for this conversation that we got to speculate a little bit. We got to celebrate Diane Oliver a little bit. And I just, I think about what Alice Walker did for Zora Neale Hurston and what Dr. Harriet Mullen did for Fran Ross. And Michael, I really hope that your efforts, not just for Diane Oliver, but for all of these writers who are out of print, can have the same kind of effect and introduce these writers to, I was going to say another generation, but, hell, our generation,
Right.
And generations to come, and really give them their rightful place in our canons and on our shelves.
Well, I will say, if anybody wants to read more of underappreciated or out of print Black writers, they can go to Catapult and read my column, The Blacklist. The Ronald L. Fair essay on Cornbread Early Me was actually published in a book called Sticking It to the Man, Counterculture and Pulp and Popular Fiction, 1950 to 1980. And yeah, I mean, those are really good places to start, I think. And I hope more Black writers, I know one of the writers that I wrote about actually got back into print, Charlotte Carter, who wrote the jazz mystery novel, Rhode Island Red. Her books actually got picked up again because of my essay. And so
Wow.
I was very happy about that. Like some of the writers, they're still alive. I mean, they're not dead. They've just been pushed out or pushed away or whatever. But, Charlotte Carter got all her books reprinted, and she's coming out with a new novel next year. So
amazing. Thank you so much for that work. I am going to bookmark that Catapult column and also try to find that anthology Right On. I need to get my hands on that.
Oh, yeah, you would like that. You would like that. I mean,
I could do a whole episode.
Okay.
We have the Right On episode.
I love it. Thank you so much, Michael A. Gonzales, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. I was so happy to be here, and I'm glad we got it together.
Me too. And if you enjoyed today's conversation and want more, become an Ursa member today by subscribing in Apple Podcasts or by going to ursastory.com/join. You'll help us produce our original stories, and you'll support our work on this podcast as we turn you on to our favorite writers and short stories. You can support this podcast by leaving a review and comment in Apple Podcasts. Until next time.